They thought power meant never being questioned, but that night, a quiet voice at the elevator changed everything. Olivia Brooks stood alone in the polished marble corridor, her reflection faint beneath the gold-trimmed walls, her uniform crisp but worn at the edges, her posture steady despite the weight pressing in from every direction. Because in a building where billion-dollar deals were whispered behind closed doors and names carried more force than laws, she was the only one still holding on to a rule no one else seemed to remember. The private elevator behind her gleamed under soft amber lighting, reserved for the highest-level executives and one man in particular, a man whose presence alone could silence an entire room without a word. And as the door slid open with a quiet chime, a figure stepped forward, tall, composed, dressed in a tailored charcoal coat that fit like it had been measured to the millimeter, his shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor, his eyes scanning the hallway with the calm certainty of someone who had never once been stopped in his life. And Olivia knew instantly who he was, even though tonight he looked different, slightly understated, almost deliberately unremarkable. But power has a way of revealing itself in the smallest details, in the way others glance and quickly look away, in the subtle shift of energy in the air, in the silence that follows behind him like a shadow. And still she did not move aside. "ID, please," she said, her voice even, not raised, not apologetic, just present, and for a fraction of a second that seemed to stretch longer than it should. The man paused mid-step, his hand still at his side, the elevator waiting open behind him as if unsure what would happen next, because no one had ever asked him that question before, not like this, not without trembling, not without immediately correcting themselves. And yet Olivia didn't flinch, her eyes steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, as though she were asking for something ordinary, something expected, while just a few feet away, a junior manager froze. Near the corner, his face draining of color as recognition hit him too late, because the man standing in front of Olivia Brooks was Alexander Kane, the owner of the building, the man whose name never appeared on directories but controlled every decision made within those walls. The man who had built an empire so vast it didn't need introductions. And still Olivia waited, her silence louder than any confrontation, because to her, the rule wasn't about who he was, it was about what was right. And somewhere deep beneath the surface, beneath the polished composure and calculated calm, something shifted in Alexander's expression, not anger, not yet, but something sharper, something unfamiliar, as if for the first time in years, someone had stepped outside the script he had written for the world around him, and the hallway, once filled with quiet movement and distant conversation, seemed to narrow into a single moment suspended in time, where power met principle, and neither one stepped back. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, tightened, pressed against every person within earshot as if the air itself was waiting for permission to move again. And Alexander Kane slowly turned his head, not fully, just enough for his eyes to meet hers, dark and unreadable, the kind of gaze that had ended conversations before they even began. Yet Olivia did not look away, not out of defiance, but because to her this was not a confrontation, it was procedure, and procedure did not bend. Somewhere behind her, the junior manager finally found his voice, though it came out thin and strained. "Miss Brooks, that will not be necessary," he said quickly, stepping forward with forced confidence that did not reach his trembling hands. "Mr. Kane is cleared for all access." But Olivia did not step aside, her posture unchanged, her attention still on the man in front of her, as if the interruption had not occurred. "All access still requires identification verification after 10 p.m., she replied calmly, quoting the policy word for word, and the manager swallowed hard, glancing at Alexander with panic creeping into his expression, because everyone knew what this moment could cost, not just for her, but for anyone associated with her. And yet the man at the center of it all did not raise his voice, did not step forward, did not assert the authority that everyone expected him to use. Instead, he studied her, really studied her, as though trying to understand what kind of person would stand still in the face of something the rest of the world avoided. And in that quiet observation, something unfamiliar began to take shape. Not irritation, not yet, but curiosity sharpened by restraint. "You are new," Alexander said finally, his voice low, controlled, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard without effort, and Olivia nodded once. 3 weeks, sir, she answered, her tone respectful but not submissive, and for a brief moment the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, more like recognition of a detail that mattered. And in 3 weeks, no one has explained to you how this building works, he continued, the words not a question but a test, one that most people would have rushed to correct, to apologize, to step aside before it went too far. But Olivia did not move. They explained the rules, she said simply, and that was when the shift happened, subtle but undeniable, because rules were one thing Alexander Kane understood better than anyone. He built them, he broke them, he rewrote them when necessary, but rarely, almost never, did anyone hold them up to him as something that applied equally. And in that moment, standing in a hallway he owned, in a building that operated at his command, he was being asked to participate in the very structure he had designed, not as the exception, but as the subject. And behind Olivia, the elevator doors began to close slowly, as if time itself refused to wait for an answer, and still she stood there, unmoved, her presence quiet but unyielding, not challenging him, not provoking him, simply holding the line where everyone else would have stepped back. And for the first time in a very long time, Alexander Kane did not immediately know what to do next. The soft click of the elevator doors closing echoed louder than it should have, sealing the moment in place, and still neither of them moved. Not Olivia, not Alexander, not even the manager who now stood frozen a few steps behind her. Caught between authority and fear, unsure which one to obey, because something had shifted beyond policy or procedure, something that no one in that hallway could quite name, and Alexander's gaze did not leave Olivia's face, not searching for weakness, not looking for defiance, but measuring something far more precise, consistency, the kind that could not be trained in a 3-week orientation, the kind that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere personal. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quieter weight, less about control and more about intent. What happens if I refuse? He asked, not as a threat, not even as a challenge, but as a genuine question, one that seemed to ripple through the space between them. And Olivia did not hesitate, because she had already considered that possibility long before this moment arrived. Then I follow protocol, sir, she said, her tone unchanged, steady as the marble beneath her feet. Access is denied until identification is verified. And behind her, the manager let out a barely audible breath, as if the words themselves had sealed her fate. But Olivia did not look back, did not seek approval or reassurance, because this was not about being right in front of others. It was about being right when it mattered. And for a brief second, something flickered across Alexander's expression, not anger, not offense, but something closer to recognition, as if he had just encountered a version of the system he had built that he no longer fully controlled. And slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, the movement calm, unhurried, drawing every eye in the hallway without a single word spoken, because no one had ever seen this before, not in person, not like this. And when he pulled out his wallet, the leather worn just enough to suggest it had been used, not displayed, he paused again, holding it in his hand, as though weighing more than just the object itself, as though considering the meaning behind the action. And Olivia remained still, her attention focused, not on who he was, but on what he was about to present. And when he finally opened the wallet and removed a card, the faint light caught the edge of it, revealing a name that everyone in the building knew without needing to read. And yet Olivia stepped closer, just one step, professional, precise, taking the card between her fingers with care, her eyes scanning the details not quickly, not nervously, but thoroughly, the way she had been trained, the way she always did, because consistency was the point. And as she looked down at the identification, something small, almost invisible to anyone else, made her pause, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for Alexander to notice, long enough for the silence to return, heavier this time, more expectant, because whatever she had just seen, it mattered. And when she lifted her gaze back to him, her expression had not changed, but the air around them had, subtly, unmistakably, as if the moment had just shifted from a test of authority to something far more dangerous, a question of truth. Olivia did not hand the card back immediately, and that hesitation, subtle as it was, carried more weight than any spoken challenge. Because it was not uncertainty, it was recognition, the kind that comes when something does not align, when a detail refuses to sit quietly where it belongs, and Alexander saw it. The slight pause, the fraction of a second where her eyes lingered just a bit longer than protocol required, and his own expression shifted, not outwardly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but internally, something tightened, something rare and unfamiliar, because he had built systems designed to eliminate exactly this kind of moment, where a single discrepancy could disrupt an entire structure, and yet here it was, held between them in silence. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice still calm, but now edged with something sharper, something more attentive, and Olivia looked back up at him, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a difference now, not in her confidence, but in the weight behind it, as if the ground beneath the conversation had shifted into something deeper than a routine check. "This identification does not match the entry record on file," she said, her tone clear, precise, not accusatory, just factual, and behind her. The manager's breath caught audibly, a sound he could not suppress this time, because what she had just said crossed an invisible line that no one else would have dared approach. Not with this man, not in this building. And yet Olivia stood there as if she had simply stated the time of day, as if truth itself required no permission. Alexander did not respond right away, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in focus, the kind that comes when a situation refuses to behave as expected. And slowly, he extended his hand, not to take the card back, but to signal patience, as if inviting her to continue, and she did. "The system shows a different middle initial and a different clearance code assigned to this floor," she added, holding the card carefully, not like evidence, not like a weapon, but like something that needed to be understood before it could be returned. And for a moment, no one moved, not the manager, not the distant staff at the end of the hallway who had quietly stopped pretending to work, not even the air itself, which seemed to hold still between each breath. And then Alexander exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding, because what Olivia had uncovered was not just a clerical error, it was a fracture, small but significant, in a system that was supposed to be seamless, controlled, precise, and more than that. It was a mirror, reflecting something he had not examined in a long time. The assumption that his presence alone overrode verification, that his identity did not need to be confirmed because it was already known, already accepted, already beyond question, and now here stood someone who did not accept that premise, not out of rebellion, but out of consistency, and that difference mattered more than any mistake on a card. "Run it again," he said quietly, his voice no longer testing, no longer probing, but deliberate, as if he had made a decision that extended beyond this moment, and Olivia nodded once, turning slightly to the security console beside her, entering the data with steady hands, each movement measured, each keystroke echoing softly in the silence, and as the system processed, the screen illuminated her face just enough to reveal the focus in her eyes, the absence of hesitation, the quiet insistence on getting it right, no matter who stood in front of her. And when the result appeared, she did not react immediately, but the slight tightening of her fingers against the console was enough to signal that whatever the system had confirmed, it was not what anyone in that hallway expected, least of all Alexander Kane. The glow of the security screen reflected faintly in Olivia's eyes as the system finished processing, and for a moment she did not speak, not because she hesitated, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to say. And in that pause the entire hallway seemed to lean in, every silent observer drawn toward a truth they were not prepared to hear. And when she finally turned back to Alexander, her expression remained composed, her voice steady, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that carried more than just protocol. "The system confirms a discrepancy," she said, each word deliberate, precise. "The identification you presented is valid, but it is not the one currently registered for access under your name tonight." And the manager behind her stiffened, his mind scrambling for explanations, for excuses, for anything that could soften what was unfolding. But Olivia did not offer any, because the system did not care about intent. It only recorded what was, and right now, what was did not align. Alexander did not interrupt, did not dismiss her, did not assert control the way everyone expected him to. Instead, he stood there, still and silent, absorbing the statement not as an insult, but as information, and that alone was enough to unsettle the balance of the room, because power, when it chooses not to react, becomes something far more difficult to predict. And after a long second, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Explain," he said, not demanding, but inviting clarity, and Olivia nodded once, turning slightly back to the screen, her fingers moving with quiet confidence as she navigated the system. "There is an active override on your profile," she continued. "A secondary credential was issued approximately 1 hour ago, with a different clearance pathway than the one on this card." And as the words settled, a subtle shift passed through Alexander's posture, not visible to most, but undeniable to someone paying attention, because that detail did not belong, not in a system he controlled, not without his knowledge, and certainly not without his authorization. And yet here it was, documented, time-stamped, undeniable. "Who authorized it?" he asked, and this time there was a trace of something sharper beneath the calm, not anger, but focus narrowing into something precise. And Olivia did not guess, did not speculate. She simply read what was in front of her. "The authorization code is internal, but it is not linked to your executive clearance," she said, then paused briefly before adding, "It appears to have been issued under a departmental override." And that was when the silence changed again. No longer just heavy, but charged, because the implication was clear. Someone within the system had created access under his name without direct authorization, and Olivia, standing there in her simple uniform, had uncovered it not through suspicion, not through investigation, but simply by refusing to skip a step. And for a moment, Alexander's gaze drifted past her, not to anyone specific, but to the space itself, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about control, about structure, about the invisible agreements that kept his world functioning. And when his eyes returned to her, there was something different in them, something that had not been there before, not dominance, not expectation, but recognition, quiet and undeniable. Because in a place where everyone knew who he was, she had been the only one who cared whether it was true, and that distinction, small as it seemed, was already beginning to change everything. The words did not echo, but their meaning did, settling into every corner of the hallway with a quiet force that no one could ignore. And for the first time since the moment began, Alexander Kane did not look at Olivia. He looked past her, beyond the marble corridor and polished glass, as if tracing something deeper within the structure he had built, because this was not just an error, it was a breach of trust disguised as efficiency, a system that had begun to move without him. And that realization did not provoke anger, it demanded clarity. "Lock the profile," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough authority to shift the energy in the space without raising it. And Olivia did not hesitate, her fingers already moving across the console, executing the command with precision, sealing the access point that had been opened without alignment. And the screen responded with a soft confirmation tone, a sound so small yet so final that it seemed to close more than just a digital pathway. It closed an assumption, one that had existed long before she ever stepped into this building. Behind her, the manager stepped forward again, this time more cautiously, his voice careful, almost rehearsed. "Sir, I am sure there is a simple explanation, these systems occasionally." But he stopped mid-sentence when Alexander raised a single hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to signal that the moment did not belong to excuses, and the manager fell silent immediately, his words dissolving before they could take shape. Because this was no longer about damage control, it was about something far more precise, accountability. Alexander turned his attention back to Olivia, not as someone being evaluated, but as someone who had revealed something essential, and there was a subtle shift in his presence, not a loss of authority, but a refinement of it, as if the focus had narrowed to what truly mattered. "Who else has access to this console?" he asked, and Olivia answered without hesitation. "Supervisors and system administrators, sir." Her tone still steady, still consistent, because consistency was the only thing she had offered from the beginning, and it had proven stronger than anything else in the room. Alexander nodded once, slowly, absorbing the answer not as information, but as direction, and for a brief moment, The silence returned again, but this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but decisive, as if something had already been set into motion beyond what anyone could see. And then, without warning, he did something no one expected. He reached forward, not for the console, not to reclaim the card, but to take the identification from Olivia's hand, his fingers brushing the edge of it with controlled precision. And as he held it, he looked at it not as a symbol of identity, but as evidence of something that had been taken for granted. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried more weight than anything he had said so far. "You followed the rule," he said, not as praise, not as observation, but as acknowledgement, the kind that does not come easily from someone like him. And Olivia met his gaze, not with pride, not with relief, but with the same calm presence she had maintained from the beginning, because to her, this was never about being seen, it was about being right. And in that moment, standing in a hallway that had always bent around power, something fundamental shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, because for the first time, the system had held, not because it was enforced, but because someone believed in it enough to stand still. And Alexander Kane, a man who had built his world on control, was now standing in front of the one thing he could not command, integrity, and he knew, without needing to say it, that this was only the beginning of something he would not be able to ignore. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because the moment had already moved beyond conversation into something quieter, something heavier, and as Alexander slipped the identification card back into his coat, his movements were slower than before, not out of hesitation, but deliberation, as if each action now carried a meaning that had not existed just minutes ago. And Olivia stepped back into her position by the console, not retreating, not advancing, simply returning to where she had always stood, her role unchanged, her presence consistent, while the manager remained frozen a few feet away, his mind racing through consequences he could not yet calculate, because this was no longer about a simple oversight. It was about a system that had failed in the presence of the one person it was meant to protect, and more importantly, it had been exposed by someone no one had considered significant enough to matter. Alexander's gaze moved briefly across the hallway, taking in the silent witnesses who now avoided his eyes, the subtle tension in their posture, the awareness that something irreversible had just occurred, and then his attention returned to Olivia, not with scrutiny, but with a quiet focus that suggested he was no longer evaluating her. He was understanding her, and that distinction changed everything. "Who trained you?" he asked, his voice low, measured, not demanding a name, but searching for a pattern, for a reason, for something that could explain what he had just seen. And Olivia answered without embellishment. "Standard onboarding, sir," she said, then after a brief pause added, "And my father." And that was the first time her voice carried something personal, not emotional, not exposed, but grounded in something beyond policy, something that could not be written into a manual. And Alexander noticed it immediately, because in that single edition, the structure shifted again, from rules to values, from procedure to principle. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because what she had just revealed was not information, it was origin. "He worked in security," Alexander said, not as a guess, but as a conclusion drawn from the way she held herself, from the precision in her tone, from the way she did not compromise even when every signal around her told her to. And Olivia nodded once. "He believed that rules only matter when they apply to everyone," she said, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and the simplicity of that statement settled into the space between them with a weight far greater than anything that had been said before, because it did not challenge power, it defined it. And for the first time, Alexander did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, but because he recognized something he had not expected to find, not in this place, not in this moment, not in her. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was reflective, as if both of them were standing on opposite sides of the same realization, seeing it from different angles but understanding its shape. And then, without raising his voice, without shifting his stance, Alexander made a decision that would ripple far beyond that hallway. Effective immediately. "No override is valid without direct verification," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and the manager straightened instinctively, the words hitting him harder than any reprimand could have, because they were not directed at him. They were directed at the system itself, and systems do not forget. Olivia did not react outwardly, but there was a subtle stillness in her, a recognition that something had changed, not because she had forced it, but because she had refused to bend. And as Alexander turned toward the elevator, the doors opening once again with a quiet chime, the space behind him no longer felt the same, because what had just happened was not an exception, it was a correction, and everyone in that hallway understood it without needing it explained, even if none of them would ever say it out loud. The elevator doors opened again with a soft, controlled chime, and Alexander stepped inside without looking back, but the space he left behind did not return to normal. It held something altered, something unsettled, as if the building itself had registered the shift and was still deciding what it meant. And Olivia remained at her post, her hands resting lightly near the console, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But the silence around her felt different now, not dismissive, not indifferent, but aware, as if every quiet glance in her direction carried a question no one had the courage to ask out loud. The manager lingered a moment longer before stepping closer, his voice lowered, cautious, no longer authoritative. "You should have let it go," he said, not harshly, but with the kind of concern that comes too late, and Olivia turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. "If I let it go once, it becomes easier the next time," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not proud, just certain, and the simplicity of that answer left him without a response, because there was no argument against consistency, only discomfort with its consequences. Down the hallway, a few employees who had pretended not to notice now moved quietly back to their tasks, but their movements lacked the usual ease, their awareness sharpened by what they had witnessed, because it was not every day that someone stood still in the face of power and did not move, and even less often that power chose not to push back. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected Alexander's stillness from every angle, his eyes fixed not on the rising floor numbers, but somewhere deeper, somewhere internal, where systems were not made of code or credentials, but assumptions. And for the first time in years, he replayed a moment not to assert control over it, but to understand it. The way her voice did not change, the way her hands did not tremble, the way she did not ask who he was before deciding what was right. And in that reflection, something unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. Because it was not resistance he faced, it was alignment, and alignment could not be dismissed. The elevator reached its destination with a quiet stop, but he did not step out immediately, his hand hovering near the control panel for just a second longer than necessary, as if the delay itself mattered, as if the moment downstairs had not yet fully released him. And when he finally moved, it was not with urgency, but with intention, the kind that signals a decision already forming beneath the surface. Back on the main floor, Olivia resumed her routine, checking entries, verifying credentials, doing exactly what she had been doing before, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, but something had, and it lingered in the smallest details, in the way no one questioned her again that night, in the way the system alerts came through more frequently, as if being rechecked, recalibrated, corrected, and in the quiet realization that the line she had held was not invisible anymore. It had been seen, recognized, and most importantly, it had been respected. And though the building would return to its rhythm by morning, though conversations would soften and routines would resume, there was something that would not return to what it was before, something that had shifted quietly, permanently, because in a place built on power, one person had chosen principle, and for the first time, power had not ignored it. By morning, the building looked the same, the marble floors still polished to a mirror shine, the glass walls still catching the early sunlight in perfect angles, the quiet hum of conversations returning as if nothing had happened. But beneath that surface, something had changed, something subtle yet irreversible, and Olivia Brooks felt it the moment she stepped back into the lobby for her next shift, not in words, not in announcements, but in the way people looked at her now, no longer past her, no longer through her, but at her, as if trying to understand what had made her stand still when everyone else had learned to step aside. The console beside her had been updated overnight. Small changes in the interface. New prompts requiring confirmation where there had once been automatic approval, and a notice quietly embedded in the system read that all executive access required dual verification. No exceptions, no overrides, and Olivia read it once, then returned to her work without comment, because to her, the rule had not changed, only the way others now followed it. Upstairs, behind closed doors where decisions were made without witnesses, Alexander Kane stood at the edge of his office window, looking out over a city that moved without knowing how closely it was being observed, and in his hand was the same identification card, now no longer just a formality, but a reminder, not of a mistake in the system, but of a moment where something he believed to be absolute had been questioned and held to its own standard. And for a long time he said nothing, not to his assistants, not to his advisors, not even to himself, because the realization did not need to be spoken to exist. When the meeting began, it was shorter than usual, more precise, and every directive he gave carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation, system audits, access reviews. Accountability structures that reached deeper than before, not because of failure, but because of exposure. Because once something hidden is seen, it cannot be unseen, and the people in that room understood it without needing explanation, even if none of them knew what had triggered it. Back in the lobby, the rhythm of the day continued, guests arriving, credentials checked, doors opening and closing with quiet efficiency, and Olivia remained exactly where she had always been, her movements measured, her voice calm, her presence steady. But there was one difference, something so small that most would miss it, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. No one asked her to step aside anymore. Late in the afternoon, as the light shifted across the floor and stretched long shadows across the marble, the elevator doors opened once again, and Alexander stepped out, not surrounded, not announced, just present, and for a brief moment, the space adjusted around him the way it always had, except this time. It did not complete the motion, because at the center of it stood Olivia, exactly where she had been the night before, and as their eyes met, there was no tension, no test, no challenge, only a quiet understanding that passed between them without a word, and Alexander reached into his coat, retrieved his identification, and held it out before she could ask, his movement calm, deliberate, not for her approval, but for alignment, and Olivia accepted it, checked it, and returned it with the same steady professionalism she had always shown. No more, no less, and the moment passed. Without interruption, without reaction, without spectacle, just two people standing within the same system, following the same rule. And as Alexander stepped past her and into the elevator, the doors closing behind him with a soft, final sound, the hallway did not fall silent this time. It continued, naturally, evenly, as if it had always been this way. But those who had seen it knew the truth, because that day, without noise, without force, without anyone needing to say it out loud, something had been restored, and that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.